people are getting their questions ready, can I guess start with the first thing that would be on some people's minds. Well, why is this relevant for Australia? Are these goals something that is for developing countries like the Millennium Development Goals? Why would Australians and Australian businesses be concerned? Perhaps start with the Mayor.
Thanks so much, John. I would propose that this is incredibly relevant to Australia because we have a very strong knowledge economy, and we're also early adopters of technology. And if you look at those two things, the knowledge economy and technology, they are the two things which provide the solutions to a lot of these goals. So I think this is a question of leadership. If Australia can grab these goals, prioritise these goals, whether it be a local government level, a state government level or a federal level, is that we can become not only global thought leaders in this space, it actually can, for this country, become a bit of an exportable commodity in terms of all of the IP associated, especially with things like climate change. The whole world is looking for solutions. Why don't we lead the pack and come up with them?
Amandine?
Yes, so I think a lot of people assume that developed economies such as Australia do really well on all the goals already, and so we don't need to do that much more work. Well, actually, last year there was a report that looked at how countries are doing on SDGs, and Australia's ranked 20th in the world, which doesn't sound too bad, but it did rank behind a significant amount of countries that have much lower GDP per capita, such as Estonia or Slovenia. And it only did really well on 3 out of the 17 SDGs. So 3 were classified green, 5 red, and the rest yellow. And in particular in the reds, as you can guess, climate action and affordable and clean energy came up. So this really shows that Australia still has a long way to go to improve on a number of those SDGs, and it can help focus action at different levels of the economy.
Scott, did you want to add anything?
We're part of a global economy, and I think, as the Lord Mayor has talked about, there's huge opportunity. There is huge unmet demand in Australia for social and affordable housing as part of creating inclusive cities, for example. And if there are mechanisms that can unlock that opportunity for risk-adjusted return, capital will flow into that space, so it will be good for the economy as well.
And Emma?
Yeah, well, I guess I'm just going to summarise it again as being a risk-return proposition. I mean, if we fail to manage these issues appropriately, we face significant risks. But there are also opportunities in terms of both thought leadership and also in terms of innovation and export capacity as well. And I guess I couldn't help thinking when I was listening to everyone else's responses that there's no doubt that the SDGs are a question for every developed economy, and particularly when I know a lot of people have been very focused on their submissions to the Finkel Review in the last week, which dealt with so many issues which are inherent to the SDGs around equity, affordability, and future economic development as well. So I think that there's room for every type of economy in looking at how these frameworks apply and how to actually leverage advantage going into the future economy, not just looking at what the last 100 years have delivered us.
Great. So we've got some questions out in the audience. There's a question down here, so we'll bring the microphone down, just down here. Thank you.
Simon Carter from Morphosis. A question for you, Emma. A client of mine last week said the TCFDs are like the next big train heading down the tunnel towards us. Are you able to comment on the timing and the nature of the impact of the TCFD on investment and real estate investment in Australia, please?
Sure, I'll just sit back and take the next 3 hours to go through the detail of it. So, I mean, for those of you who don't know, it was officially launched at the Paris talks in December 2015. It was a year-long process convened under the G20's Financial Stability Board committee. The draft recommendations were published in December 2016, and the final report will be presented to the heads of government at the G20 in mid-year, so July. But the question of when that process began and when it will begun to be implemented is a little more blurry, because to a great extent it actually represents the culmination of over a decade of thinking going on across different parts of the finance sector about what the financial risks are associated with climate change. And to some extent it represents the, I guess you could almost say, the end of one phase and the beginning of another in terms of how investors think about climate change related materiality for their investments and for their own portfolios. For each, how these actual impacts play out will be different in every industry sector. And so what the framework, the TCFD framework has sought to do is to provide sort of baseline recommendations for every industry sector that they need to be applying, and then additional sector-specific technical guidance as well. And there's a buildings and materials additional supplementary guidance, which is probably most relevant. For the property sector in terms of specific issues that need to be addressed and specific challenges. But to some extent, people have already begun picking up the recommendations. I think you're already beginning to see it reflected in reporting. Some of it is a sort of next evolution, as I said, of existing frameworks like CDP. A lot of the thinking in there about risk and strategy is already there. And a lot of it's looking to draw on traditional financial accounting approaches to materiality as well. So technically it's been running for a year and a half and has another 6 months to go. But as to when the whole thinking around it began and how quickly it'll be implemented, I mean, it's definitely a part of like the stream of progress rather than necessarily a distinct process in and of itself.
Thank you. Some further questions? Down here, yes, down round the corner. We're coming down to you. We need a spotter like at an auction.
Charles Farouk Hill from Jazz Lang LaSalle. It's a general question. Over the last year, we've seen an increased wave of right-wing populism, both internationally and nationally. And the SDGs are pretty much an antithesis of what the populism that they're putting out of self-reliance and non-interference by international bodies. Do the panel think that one nation here or Trump or the forces behind Brexit are a significant threat to our ability to meet those goals?
Good question. Maybe start with someone who's in the political process. Mayor? Thanks,
Charles. I mean, look at the climate change debate most specifically, globally. It's becoming increasingly polarised. I was fortunate enough to speak at the Paris COP21 in December 2015, and I must say the excitement that came out of that conference was absolutely palpable. But look at the environment since that time. The US signed on, China signed on. We're not quite sure what the US has now got to do, but look at China. And China now looks like it might become a global leader in this sustainability space, and they've got the resources, the resolve, and the many other things in which to do it. So, and they've got economic and environmental necessities around that. So it's a very challenging debate. Many of those 17 goals are not only reliant on cities to operate on their own. Cities don't operate in a vacuum. Nations don't operate in a vacuum. So there needs to be a level of global collaboration in order to deliver on a number of these goals. Not all, but certainly a number of them. And it's a great challenge, I must say. And it does kind of hark back to the very role of the UN in terms of holding this process together in a world which is looking increasingly fractured at the moment. So it's a great challenge, but I think the way to do this is to very, very clear for governments of any persuasion to be very clear in terms of managing this conversation with their populace around the what's in it for you factor. And whether it's climate change, and that could be an economic opportunity, that could be an opportunity for technology and entrepreneurship and investment capital, manage it in that way. When I look at climate change, I think sometimes the environmental benefits are self-evident. The difficult part is to manage the climate change debate in an economic context. And that's becoming, I think, slightly more difficult in today's environment.
I think that's a great point about highlighting that actually what the goals provide is something that everyone wants, which is housing, good environment, education for their kids and a decent health system. But it's explaining that it's not some alien United Nations bureaucracy, it's actually what people want in their ordinary lives.